In the last episode of my final thoughts with Crawford versus Spence and UFC 291, I had left off the video mentioning, well, what is left after all the undisputed belts are claimed? What is going to happen with the matchups and the landscapes of boxing? Well, for one, I think one of the greatest things that I can leave off from that particular segment and what I can add on to this one is to say that what you're going to get are new contenders rising. Like, for example, the WBA, or I believe the WBO, is claiming that Errol Spence, in his boots, has to go out and fight none other than Terence Crawford as a mandatory. Now, I would have never seen that coming a couple of months ago, let alone 1 week ago. You're talking about Boots Ennis as the contender, number one contender at that, and the mandatory contender that they're asking Errol Spence to fight. Sign me up. Because I tell you what, if Terence Crawford was never undisputed, this would have never happened. Now, what would you do at 135 with Devin Haney? He's now undisputed, but in the midst of that, you had a WBA regular championship fight with Ryan Garcia taking on Tank Davis. So, is he really undisputed, or are there other belts out there that are sanctioned by these sanctioning bodies as to say that, you know what, you are the champion and this guy is the diamond champion and this guy is the regular champion? Now, for all my MMA followers who don't understand the sanctioning bodies of boxing, I know how confusing this is, and I completely understand. But I can tell you that having an undisputed champion will definitely create a lot less issues in terms of, I guess, mandatories and having to face these number one contenders, having to go through this guy, having to go through that guy. Because look, let's say if for whatever reason Terence Crawford doesn't go out and fight Boots Ennis, they can possibly strip him. Look, they're already talking about stripping Charlo right now. I believe he has a mandatory going on. He may want to fight Canelo. Maybe he doesn't fight Canelo, and then they're going to try to strip him because of that. Or strip him because of some mandatory that the WBO or the WBA or the WBC is making him fight, and he's going to refuse it. He's going to decline it. And guess what? This is the same thing that happened with Josh Taylor at 140. The guy was the undisputed champion at 140 pounds, has a fight with Jack Cattrall. He goes the distance with Jack Cattrall. Very controversial. Many people thought that Jack Cattrall won that fight in the same similar fashion that a lot of people would have thought Johnny Hendricks won the fight against George St. Pierre. Yeah, it was one of those fights. Islam Makhachev versus Volkanovski. It was one of those fights in the MMA terms, in the way that I can make you understand it through the boxing side. So that is what you have going on with the mandatories and all these things that come about with the sanctioning bodies. Yes, there's a lot of clarity if, let's say, you have an undisputed champion. But at the same time, not really, because they can strip you out of that anytime they want and possibly give your belt to a vacant fight that's coming up with two contenders. That's the reality of the sanctioning bodies and what you have to face in boxing. Now, the other side of that, the other side of the things that you have to understand is that boxing is now creating a lot of these different glam fights that they have going on. What I've mentioned in the past podcasts and episodes, something to the effect of, let's say, Francis Ngannou and Tyson Fury. Now that's going on. How about this weekend? Now you have Jake Paul taking on none other than Nate Diaz. That's another glam fight for the boxing world, right? So now the boxing world is giving you the mandatories that the hardcores want, and then they're also giving you the glam and Hollywood fights that, let's say, the casual fans want. And then on top of that, Nate Diaz brought his 209 Stockton mentality into the boxing world, in which he's known for in the MMA world. And guess what happened today? They got into a brawl. The brawl happened between their security. From what it looks like in the video, it looks like Nate Diaz's guys were trying to, I guess, instigate the situation, but at the same time, Jake Paul's guys was somewhat inviting to the chaos that, let's say, the Diaz crew members wanted to imply, wanted to direct, and wanted to engage in. And they would happily oblige to that. So that's what you got in that situation, was a brawl. I think part of that, too, is the fact that Nate Diaz was very much frustrated in the fact that he had to, I'm sorry, not Nate Diaz, Jake Paul was frustrated at Nate Diaz because of the fact that Nate Diaz did not want to play the game. And what do I mean by playing the game? Well, Nate Diaz is known for being a trash talker. He didn't do much of that up until this press conference. He even left the face-off that they did, which is a traditional boxing thing that they do, where they have two fighters come and meet up in some kind of studio with a host there, and this time it was Ariel Helwani. Another famous example of this is when you had Dylan White and none other than Derek Chisora. This is where basically they got into a fight, or I think someone threw a water at someone, and then, they got into a brawl, and it was in between Johnny Nelson. Another example of that is Derek Chisora with David Hay. Just a whole bunch of examples with Derek Chisora. Let's just say that Derek Chisora is the Nate Diaz of MMA. I'm sorry, that Derek Chisora is basically the Nate Diaz of boxing, and Nate Diaz is the Derek Chisora of MMA in that comparison. So now you got this drama going on, and I think it may help the pay-per-view numbers. Now, the pay-per-view numbers have just recently been released by Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford, as opposed to the pay-per-view with UFC 291. And guess what? I was correct about my prediction of UFC winning that night. Now, they had about 700,000 buys in comparison to 650,000 buys on the boxing side with Spence and Crawford. Now, what is the reason for that? Well, there's multitudes of reasons. For one, you could say that the streaming aspect of, let's say, illegal downloads and sharing and that kind of a matter may have affected the entire thing. But also, the other side of that is perhaps maybe the UFC just has a much more consistent fan base, right? I'm not talking about casuals versus hardcores. I'm just talking about the simple fact that MMA has more of a consistent fan base than they do in boxing. And why is that? Well, because boxing is more of a fickle sport in terms of the individuals that they go out and support. Whereas with MMA, if you're an MMA fan, what you're really supporting is the UFC or Bellator or PFL or any of these shows that they put on. But in particular, the UFC is really good at making the brand a higher supremacy than, let's say, the individual athlete. So that means what you're going to get is a guaranteed amount of, let's say, pay-per-view buys, an amount of number of audience that you know is going to come and buy the pay-per-views or buy the tickets to sit front row or all the way up to the nosebleeds. Now, let's look at the technical aspect of this fight. Now, with Nate Diaz, I don't highly rate him right now at 38 years old being able to beat Jake Paul. However, Jake Paul does make a lot of mistakes. You've seen that in the Tommy Fury fight. You've even seen that in some of the fights that he's won, including his amateur fight with KSI's little brother Deji in one of the biggest amateur fighting events that they both held when they were just starting out boxing, right? So Jake does have those holes in his game, and that just comes with just being inexperienced. Now, has he gotten better over the years? Yes, he's definitely gotten better. He's gotten even more explosive, and he's gotten even stronger with the physique that you've recently seen him. Now, with Nate Diaz, at 38 years old, not all 38 years old and people that are in their early 40s are all equal. Obviously, you see Yoel Romero even up to his mid-40s, the guy is still explosive. Now, why is that? Well, for the simple fact that he has a foundation that he's built over the years. Who else is explosive in boxing at an older age? I don't know too many boxers that are highly explosive at an older age the way that they were when they were younger. But Yoel Romero on the MMA side is a great example of that. Unfortunately, Nate Diaz is not a quintessential example of that. In fact, what Nate Diaz is somebody that has great cardio because he works at it a lot. Now, with Nate Diaz and his brother Nick, the one thing they don't work on a lot is explosiveness. I remember an interview that Nick Diaz did a couple of years back, maybe even 10 years ago, right after the George St. Pierre fight, about how he references that George St. Pierre gets into a lot of injuries because of all the explosive workouts that he does. But at the same time, you got to ask yourself, as an MMA athlete, as a wrestler, and as a combat athlete in total, how are you going to have that thumping power, that explosiveness, being able to mix speed and strength at the same time in ways that you can really debilitate your opponent into the land of unconsciousness? How do you do that? How do you do that without training those things? Do you just naturally have to have that and then you just work on cardio all day? Well, Nate Diaz is a cardio machine. He's a cardio guy. But you got to ask yourself, when it comes to finishing power and it comes to hand speed and it comes to being able to do things athletically, I think Jake Paul has the advantage of that just based on his youth alone and the fact that he does these workouts. And by the way, if you want to check out the workouts that I mean when building explosiveness and conditioning on top of that in the MMA side, I want you to look at my previous videos that I did where I basically demonstrate how to do that, where I recorded my entire training session in terms of MMA conditioning, strength, speed, and explosivity. Those are the things that you need in order to be first, in order to catch your opponent before he catches you. So what does that mean? That means that what I see in this fight is that I can see Jake Paul out jabbing Nate Diaz. He's going to learn a lot from the fight that he had with Tommy Fury, in which Tommy Fury was able to implement his long reach to reach Jake Paul. And Jake Paul, having that kind of experience, is now going to understand distance way better than he's ever had in his previous fights. And now he's taking on Nate Diaz, who does have a long reach, but at the same time, doesn't have the same type of reach that Tommy Fury has. So, for sure, 100%, Jake Paul is prepared to fight in the range. Now, in the close range, this is where the dog in Nate Diaz comes out. This is where Nate Diaz can possibly walk him down. If you notice, one of the things that Nate does in the MMA side is he walks you down. He tries to get you tired, right? And a lot of people who have sparred, who have competed, understand exactly what I mean when I say that when a guy walks forward to you, it's pressure, especially if you know that the guy hits hard and you know that the guy has capabilities of doing so. Now, at the highest level of MMA and boxing, everybody hits hard. And I think that is the problem that Nate Diaz is going to present to none other than Jake Paul in this fight. And why is that? Well, because if Jake Paul does not oblige him when he walks forward, Nate Diaz is just going to continue to walk him down. If you notice in the Mayweather-McGregor fight, this is literally what Mayweather did to McGregor, because he knew that he had the advantage of being able to just walk him down, being able to block his shots from close range, because he knows that McGregor was a great range fighter. He can hit you from a range, but what happens if he comes at you close range? And I could picture Nate Diaz doing that just based on his abilities, based on the fact that that is where he's at in his fighting career, and that's just how he knows how to fight and how he's always held guys down in the stand-up department in MMA. And I don't see how he's going to do anything different in this boxing match against Jake Paul. Now, how do I see this fight? To be honest with you, I see this going the distance. And I think this is going to be a great experience for Jake Paul going 10 rounds. But at the same time, I could really see Nate Diaz surviving all 10 rounds of this fight. Why? Because let's face it, Nate Diaz has a tough chin. It's very difficult to take Nate out. No matter what level you think Nate Diaz is at, his chin holds up more than anybody in MMA and probably even in boxing. And you also have to take in consideration that this guy has had decades of experience sparring with the legend Andre Ward. So who is Jake Paul in that aspect when he takes on somebody like that? Well, I'll tell you who Jake Paul is in comparison to Nate Diaz. A much more explosive younger man, a guy who has knockout power, and a guy who is willing to implement that against somebody like Nate Diaz, who doesn't have the same explosive or the same type of strength power that, let's say, Jake Paul has. However, nobody really finishes Nate Diaz in MMA or in boxing, none other than Josh Thompson. And by the way that Josh Thompson was able to do that was he connected with a few head kicks to debilitate Nate Diaz, and then was able to rock him and ground and pound him to the ground for the finish. By the way, if you guys don't know, Josh Thompson is the legendary 155 fighter out of AKA, who, by the way, trains with Khabib and Islam in American Kickboxing Academy out in San Jose. So shout outs to him, shout outs to his show at the Weigh In podcast with another MMA legend referee, John McCarthy. But nonetheless, that is the guy who last finished Nate Diaz, other than Jorge Masvidal, which was done by a doctor stoppage. And by the way, because New York has these really strict laws when it comes to guys bleeding, and then the doctors don't want to lose their license, so that has something to do with it. But nonetheless, realistically, the only guy that is really finished Nate Diaz is Josh Thompson. I don't see Nate Diaz getting finished in this fight, but I see Nate Diaz getting outpointed. So my final prediction for this one, I'm going to go with Jake Paul by decision. But welcome to the Theater of the Unknown, and enjoy the fights, because we will this weekend.